So just for some introductory remarks, we're talking about theism today. The theist side, they'll give two arguments. The atheist side, they'll give two arguments for atheism, and we'll alternate. Okay, is there anything else I need to say? All right, so I guess we can start with the theist first argument.
The argument that I'll be presenting here is the anthropic argument for theism. So let me start by telling you about a view called the self-indication assumption. What the self-indication assumption says is that your existence is X times likelier on a theory on which there are X times as many candidates for being your present self. So if there are two theories and one says there are more people you might be, that theory, the self-indication assumption says, is more likely. And so, for example, suppose a coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, one person's created. And if it comes up tails, 10 people get created. What SIA says in this case is that if you're created by the coin flip, you should think at 10 to 1 odds that the coin came up tails. And the basic idea is that if it came up tails, it's 10 times likelier that you would be created because 10 times as many people get created. Another application is there are two theories. One of them says the universe is finite, while the other one says the universe is infinite. The SIA would say that upon being created, you should be sure that the universe is infinite because that makes it infinitely likelier that you would exist. Okay, so with that background out of the way, let me go through the core steps in the argument. So the first premise is that the self-indication assumption is correct. The second is that if the self-indication assumption is correct, the number of people that exist is some very large infinite. 3 is the odds of very large infinite of people existing is much higher given theism than atheism. So the fact that this very large infinity of people does exist strongly favors theism over atheism. So the core idea is you exist. That's more likely if there are more people. It's X times likelier if there are X times more people. And so you should think that the number of people that exist is this giant infinity, and that's much likelier given theism than atheism. And specifically, so the number of possible people, there are reasons to think that it's some very large infinity. So if you think people can be made up of points, then there are at least 2 possible people, because that's the number of ways you can arrange points. If you think that you can just make copies of people indefinitely, then the number of people that could exist is too large to be a set, because you can copy people for any number of times corresponding to a set. And so if you think the number of people that there could be is this very large infinity, then if a number of people that existed, if the number of people that existed was smaller than that infinity, then it would be very, very surprising that you existed. That would mean that 0% of possible people would exist, and it would be super surprising that you in particular would exist. Now, let me just clarify 2 things about the argument. So first is that the argument doesn't require the assumption that every possible person exists. It just requires the assumption that the number of people that exists is equal in number to the number of possible people. So as an analogy, the number of natural numbers, which are like 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., is equal in size, at least going by cardinality, to the number of prime numbers. Even though not every natural number is a prime number. They can be paired to 1 to 1. You can pair 1 with the first prime, 2 with the second prime, and so on. And second, when I tell people this argument, often they think that I'm claiming that there's this hidden underground conspiracy where huge numbers of people are hiding in Earth. The claim is that there's a big multiverse. Okay, that's the claim. That's where all the people are. So I do not think that I'm well aware that there are only 8 billion people on Earth. Okay, so now let's talk about the premises. So let's start with the premise that says that if this very large infinity of people exists, that favors theism. So why think that premise is true? Well, I mean, the basic reason to think that premise is true is that if God exists, it makes a lot of sense that there would be this number of people. It's good to create, at least on most standard views of population ethics. And so if God's going to bother to create, he's not just going to stop after 1 universe or 10. It's at least reasonably plausible that he'd create a bunch of universes. So given theism, we'd expect with reasonable odds a very, very large infinity of people to exist. In contrast, given atheism, you need a really weird and gerrymandered multiverse to get one of the right size. By default, multiverses don't get you the right number of people. By default, they'll just get you Aleph null people. So they're larger and smaller infinities. Aleph null is the smallest infinity. If the universe was infinitely large, there would only be Aleph null people. You need kind of a high degree of gerrymandering to get a multiverse that has a number of people that equals the number of possible people. Now, this is very easy for God, but very hard for naturalism because it needs a high degree of gerrymandering. And one way you can see that this isn't expected on atheism is that basically the number of atheists in human history who have thought this is what reality looks like, you can count them on one hand. And these views the views that predict the right number of people, like David Lewis's view, which is modal realism, where he says every possible world exists, these views tend to have other big problems, potentially collapse induction. We can talk more about that if people think they're plausible atheistic views. But the basic point is just, this is a really large number of people, and it's too large to get naturally, absent some sort of weird math and gerrymandering. Okay. So where we're at so far is we've seen if SIA is right, then you should think that there's a giant infinity of people, because that's the number of possible people. And if the number of actual people that existed was smaller, then it would be very, very unlikely that you would exist. And remember, SIA is just the view that your existence favors theories on which there are more people. So you should, by SIA, you should think the number of people that exists is the very most it could be. So then we get to the question of why I think the SIA is right. So I'm going to give, I think, 3 arguments for the SIA. So the first argument is this one. So imagine one person is created, and then a second person is created if a coin comes up tails. So one guy's created, coins flipped. If tails, a second person is created. So I claim you should have the following sets of credences. So you should first think the odds that I'm the first guy and the coin will come up heads equal the odds that I'm the first guy and the coin will come up tails. After all, if you knew that you were the first person, you should think at 1/2 odds that the coin would come up heads and 1/2 odds it would come up tails. And second, you should think the odds that I'm the first guy and the coin will come up tails equals the odds that I'm the second guy and the coin has come up tails. In other words, if you knew that the coin came up tails, you should think it's equally likely that you're the first guy and the second guy. So in other words, heads and you're the first person equals in probability, tails and you're the first person equals in probability, tails and you're the second person. So then tails is twice as likely as heads. But remember, the only difference between heads and tails is that on tails, there are 2 people, and on heads, there are 1 person. So if you should have these credences, if you should think tails is twice as likely as heads, which follows from these premises, then you ought to think at 2/3 odds that the coin you ought to adopt a self-indication assumption. And this is basically not compatible with the other views in the literature that reject the self-indication assumption. Okay, so that's one argument for SIA. Here's another kind of similar argument. So imagine one person's created, and then a coin's flipped. And if it comes up tails, 9 other people get created. So one person's created, coin's flipped, tails, 9 more people get created. Now suppose that you don't know who you are. So at first you have no idea what your birth rank is, and then you're told that you're the first person. So if you rejected SIA before learning you were the first person, you would think heads and tails were equally likely. And then given that the coin came up heads, it would be guaranteed that you'd be the first person. Well, given that the coin came up tails, it would only be 10% odds that you'd be the first person. So in other words, if on the self-indication, so on non-SIA views, you used to think heads and tails were equally likely, and then you learn you're the first person, which is 10 times likelier given heads and tails. So then you end up thinking at 10-to-1 odds, the coin comes up heads. But now you know you're the first person, so you know the coin hasn't been flipped yet. And so on non-SIA views, you end up with this bizarre result that a fair coin that hasn't been flipped yet, you ought to think at 10-to-1 odds that it will come up heads, when your credence in a fair, chancy future event should equal its objective probability. You shouldn't, before a coin gets flipped, think at 2/3 odds or 10/11 odds that it will come up heads. You should think at 1/2 odds it will come up heads, because coins come up heads half the time. So now you get around this if you're an SIAer, because the SIAer, because tails predicts 10 people get created, they start out thinking tails is 10 times likelier than heads. And then upon learning they're the first person, that's 10 times likelier given heads and tails, so the probabilities exactly cancel out. And then you end up thinking at exactly 50% odds that the coin will come up heads. So on SIA, you have no problem. On non-SIA views, you have to think that the odds of a fair coin coming up heads are something other than 1/2. So basically, the TLDR is if you should think upon seeing a coin that the odds of it coming up heads are 50%, you should believe in God. Okay, the last argument for the self-indication assumption concerns repeating this coin flip scenario. So imagine every million years. Oh, sorry. Before I say this, I should say something about why I'm talking about coin flip scenarios. The idea is just this is to isolate the kind of probabilistic structure, and the same sorts of arguments can be made with any other chancy events with some other objective probability. These are just like simple sample cases to kind of test the principles. And the other views in the literature, other than the SIA, would say different things. Okay, so imagine that every million years, the following experiment is done. A coin gets flipped. If it comes up heads, 1 person's created. And if it comes up tails, 10 people get created. And they're repeating the scenario. So in this case, obviously, you should think at 10/11 odds that the coin that created you, if you get created from this, you should think at 10/11 odds the coin that created you came up tails, because 10/11 of people get created by the tails coin flip. So if you repeat the scenario, non-SIA views, everyone agrees that you should think at 10/11 odds that the coin came up tails. But then if you should think that if the scenario is repeated, then you should think that if the scenario is done only once, the odds that a coin that was flipped 5 minutes ago that created one person of heads and 10 people of tails, the odds that it came up heads shouldn't depend on like what was happening millions of years in the past. So if you think that the odds that a coin is flipped don't depend on what was happening in the distant past, the odds that it came up heads, then you should be an SI error, basically. So those are kind of the big arguments for SIA. Excited for, so that's the opening.
Yeah, well, first of all, Matthew, thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
I guess for a clarificatory question that I would want to ask before getting into anything else is, could you define what you mean by atheism in your argument with a little bit more specificity?
So I was just talking about the assumption that there's no God. So if there is no God, then I think it's very unlikely you'd get the right number of people. Now, even if you want to restrict atheism to just be some more limited hypothesis like naturalism, it is still extremely surprising, given naturalism, that you would get the right number of people.
Okay. So would you agree then that atheism, as construed as the hypothesis that there is no God, would include, for instance, many like non-naturalistic hypotheses that are maybe weird, like teleological laws, things like this, that might seem a little bit spooky, but don't fall under, for instance, like the Oppian naturalistic version? Like you would agree with that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And also different interpretations of the many world hypotheses, correct?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm wondering what you think. So isn't there a naturalistic hypothesis that makes the person plenitude principle like pretty plausible, namely the Everettian many worlds hypothesis?
So I don't think so, for a few reasons. So one thing to say is I think there's debate about exactly how many people the Everettian plenitude gets you, where the things I've heard people say range from no fact of the matter, finite, aleph null, beth 1, beth 2. And I think there's not agreement about exactly how many people it gets you. But in any case, I think there's reason to think this isn't enough, because there's reason to think that the number of possible people is too large to be a set. So even if we go by the broadest interpretation of many worlds, where it gets you the most people, I still think it's not enough. And then I also think if many worlds is possible, I think that the number of different like permutations of the wave function would then be the power set of the number of original wave functions. And so then there would be about 3 possible people. And so if it's possible, then it doesn't get you enough people.
Sure. So just a question on this. So I think that there are 2 things to say. So before I potentially invoke divine psychology, even though like I guess that's what I'm becoming known for, right? Like that's like my thing. I just want to say this. So on theism, you say, look, that we predict a lot of lives, correct? I think that we could go sort of a pass deeper, which is to say the types of lives that are being predicted, right? So on the Everettian many worlds hypothesis, I mean, there are going to be some crappy lives in there, right? You're going to have the moderately unhappy fat diabetic person, to use a Steve-esque example. And there are going to be quite a few of those individuals, and we're going to see a proliferation of that. There are going to be people who go from mild to worse, Amos like that example. And so on the Everettian many worlds hypothesis, we're going to protect these crappy lives, right? There are going to be a bunch of people that are going to be couch potatoes, wasting their lives watching reality TV. If God's in the business of sort of like maximizing the good lives and whatnot, do we expect things to look sort of the way that they do with the distribution of evil and whatnot? And so we have these 2 theories, right? So it seems like the Everettian interpretation, while it might have some drawbacks, as you alluded to, is going to square well with the idea that, you know, some of these lives aren't going to be that great and they're not going to be that fantastic, but you do get a plenitude, right? Or like you're going to get a ton of them. Whereas on the theistic hypothesis, which kind of has the goodness baked into it, right? It's kind of like a signature feature of it. Why there's so many like crappy lives is a little bit confusing. So I was wondering what you make of this sort of like trade-off in that respect.
Certainly, I agree that it's at least somewhat surprising, given theism, that there are as many lives that are as crappy as they are. That's a sort of well-known atheistic argument. It's called the problem of evil. I think it's a perfectly good argument. I think it has a reasonable amount of force. But I think when analyzing any particular argument, we should try to like avoid the temptation to like just cobble together all the other pieces of data where, okay, so maybe your theory better predicts that there's evil. And then I'm going to say, in my theory better, I don't think the Everett thing predicts very well a number of features. It doesn't predict there's consciousness or psychophysical harmony or, a million other things. And so if we just want to look at the argument is about the specific fact, which is that there's this very, very large number of people. And that fact I claim favors theism. Then there are other facts about the quality of the life where you might say there's some aspects of it that favor atheism, and I say there's some aspects, and more significant aspects, that favor theism, but those just get us into the waters of different arguments. And then the other thing to say is just, as I said before, I actually don't think the Everettian interpretation gets you enough people. And I think it has other sort of philosophical problems. But
So I really like the response, and also I appreciate the back and forth. It's fun. It's fun talking to you. So this kind of gets to the gerrymandering concern. If I could just ask this, and I'll pass it off to Steve because I know that he's going to have 50 billion objections. The way that I see it is that there's sort of like a dilemma for the argument. I know that you'll probably resist the dilemma and you'll think that this is not the way that it's not successful, but I'm going to propose it anyway. So here's the question, right? So the question is something along the following lines. Let me just pull up my dilemma. Okay, so does theism predict an observer plenitude? Yes or no? If yes, the motivation for thinking why that's the case is going to succumb to an undercutting defeater because of divine psychology. And then if no, if theism does not predict an observer plenitude, then this just looks like an argument for modal realism of some Lewisian kind that you don't like, right? Where I'm going to say something, because you said earlier, you said, well, look, you get this weird, gnarly gerrymandering on the naturalistic view or something quasi-naturalistic where you say something of the following effect. You say, well, look, in order to get the plenitude that you want to on an atheistic picture, you have to believe into one of these like bizarro bong rip modal theories that was dreamed up in a bathtub in Pittsburgh. Well, fine, but maybe the self-indication hypothesis or the self-indication assumption just shows like we should prefer that, like that might be true. So what I'm wondering is like on the one hand, if you want to justify that theism actually predicts the observer plenitude, you get the divine psychology worry. If you don't think that it predicts it, which you don't think, it might just get to this like generic modal realism type argument, or it might go into the Everettian stuff. Does that make sense as like a...
Yeah, so I of course take the first horn of the dilemma. I think that, so it will require some claims about divine psychology. Now, these will be very modest claims about divine psychology, given that the odds are so low on atheism. These will be claims of the form, it's not ridiculously astronomically improbable on theism that you get the right number of people. And then that, I think, is a very plausible assumption. I think that assumption is right. I mean, so it's good to live a good life. And so it would be weird on theism if God had reason to create like just one universe and then stop at that point. He can create way more good stuff, and it's good to create good stuff. And the sort of standard views of population ethics and the right views of population ethics imply that it's good for well-off people to be brought into existence. So I don't think we need to bring in like, we're not trying to like guess God's favorite toothpaste flavor here. We're talking about whether God would think it's good to create just astronomically large amounts of good stuff. And it doesn't seem to require particularly exotic or plausible claims about divine psychology to think at least God doing that is not extremely unlikely.
Well, why don't you just show how likely it is and do a calculation then?
Well, I don't think I can do that for any action, for any psychology of any person, right?
Right, but you're the one making the claim, and so the person making the claim has to provide the justification.
I can also, so I would also make the claim that the probability that, so if I went to your house and I saw there was a note written out that said, I'm leaving the house to buy cereal, I similarly claim that I would be very confident that you wrote the note, signed Nathan. I don't know the exact odds that you would write that versus the odds that it would be a random ink spill. But what I do know is that the odds would be much higher. In order to say that it's much likelier that an agent would do something than that would be done by a non-agent, you don't have to know the precise probability that the agent would do the thing.
Right. But just to come back on that point, so let's zoom out. I mean, what we're doing in this case, specifically the one that we're involved with, is we're going from the perceived value of a state of affairs, right? So the perceived value of a state of affairs, namely being like the value of observer plenitude, if I could use that nomenclature. And then we're going to how God values that state of affair. And what I'm going to claim, a la Perry Hendricks, who's your favorite theist and philosopher, is that this inference is a little bit unjustified. Amos is laughing because he agrees. We actually talked about this before the debate. Is that inference is going to be unjustified, or we're not going to have a really good reason to think that, because there's no public antecedent reason that we recognize for thinking that, you know, our assessment of things is going to in any way resemble God's assessment of things. So what I'm worried about here is that the very type of skeptical theism that's employed, for instance, to deflect the problem of evil is going to be very much applicable to the argument that you're producing, because it employs a high probability premise for which there's an undercutting defeater. I understand that there are ways of resisting this, but the key thing is to say something like this, and I could just pose it in another question. And I know that Steve has different styles of objections, but here's one way of putting it. It goes like, why not think that it's just absurdly unlikely that God would create anything, right? So God maxes out the good independently. And you might think to yourself, well, maybe it's just he's in the business of surveying the possible worlds, contemplating their goodness, rolling it around in his palate, so to speak, and then not actualizing them. I mean, like, why not think that he would just do that?
Oh, I mean, the reason is because it's good to create. In that, if you create people and you give them infinitely good lives so that their existences are infinitely fortunate, then this is a very good thing. And I think this follows from standard views in population ethics.
Yep.
Everyone accepts it on the negative end. So imagine the worst possible being, the most evil being conceivable, and then ask, would that being create lots of people who are miserable and like torture them, or would that being create nothing and just be content to dwell in their own malevolence? It seems very obvious that being would create lots of horrible things.
Sure.
In logic, I think
jump in and ask
would create lots of good things. Sorry, just very briefly. And so if that's plausible, if that's almost guaranteed on the evil end, it seems at least not astronomically improbable in light of our evidence on the good end that the being would do a lot of creating. Sorry.
Okay, yeah. If I could just say one point before Steve comes in. So the point is something like this, though. I mean, we could concede that it would be let's say that we concede that it's God finds valuable creation. So we're going to go on the axiological dimension, right? Here's the further question that we're going to bring up, though at least I'm going to bring up, right? Is that you don't know what values he's attached to. And in order to know how somebody's going to act, you need to know their value attachments. Here's the analogy, right? Okay, so you go to someone, they're going to a career fair. I'm not going to bring up another ridiculous example unless you want me to, and Amos wants me to, but I'm going to reject it. The point is something like this, right? So they go to the career fair, and then they find all the careers in the career fair really valuable, okay? And then you go to the person, let's call them James, and you say, well, which of those careers are you going to pick, right? And you have to guess, right, based off of the fact that they find everything valuable. And the idea is this: you don't know what they're going to pick just on the fact that they find everything valuable. You need to know this additional information, which is which of those careers are they attached to? Namely, of the things that they find valuable, which are they attached to? So it could be the case that God finds it valuable to create, but he's just not attached to that value. Alternatively, and then this is the deontological element of things, you could say that when you consider all of the agent neutral reasons that God has, he just doesn't weight creation that highly. Is that possible? Sure, it's totally possible. There could be these countervailing reasons that are unbeknownst to us that tip the scales against creation. Now, if we consider theism on its own, that God is in the business, for instance, of doing the thing that's most right or most good, both of these things might, in principle, speak against creation. So when we're judging the probabilities of these things, it just doesn't seem like we're adequately placed to determine with any degree of reliability what God would do in that type of position. And so consequently, I don't know if we have an adequate basis to judge like whether it's more likely or like less likely than naturalism. Now, I know that might not persuade everyone. That's my objection. But with that, I think I'm gonna like you respond. I'm gonna go to Steve because Steve has a totally different line of response, and I couldn't help myself with divine psychology. So
I think we just got out of time, though. I mean, on this segment.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. So I guess the thing to say is just that. So I think it's important to distinguish between different ways in which probabilities might be kind of underdetermined. So if all you mean is something like, because there might be unknown reasons, who knows if a rational agent should assign probabilities of 30% or 70%? Okay, fine by me. But if the claim is that it's so radically undetermined that we can't do any precise probabilistic arguments so that it never updates us in any direction. I don't think that's right, and I don't see a reason why that would be true in a way that isn't characteristic of just any action by any agent. In any time an agent acts, there might be unknown features of their psychology that we're not aware of that might preclude them from doing the action. And I mean, just consider on the negative end, on the negative end, maybe a maximally evil being would be disposed to, would not be disposed, would have countervailing reasons to not create the infinite torture chamber. Okay, but if you looked around and it was all the infinite torture chamber, that was all that the world was, I think that would be very strong evidence that there was a maximally evil being. Maybe not decisive evidence, but at least pretty good evidence. So similar thing on the positive.
All right. Yeah. Why don't you go ahead, Steve? Yeah, your turn.
So my question is just, why doesn't this commit the inverse gambler's fallacy? That is, let's say that I win the something in Vegas. I win the slot machine. And I say, look, there must be millions of people playing the slot machine, which makes it more likely that I'm going to win it. But of course, my winning it is independent. The likelihood of my winning it is independent of how many other people are playing slot machines out there. Why aren't you making a similar sort of argument?
So it's importantly different in that it's not that the number of people who are not you impacts the probability it's not that the number that people apart from you impact the probability of your existence. It's that you have uncertainty about which centered world you are. And so you don't know which person you are. And so then under uncertainty about which person you are, the theories on which there are more people makes it likely that whichever one you are would exist. And so the best way to see this is in the case that I talked about with the coin flip, where one person's created, then a coin's flipped, and if it comes up tails, a second person's created. So in this case, you should split your uncertainty 3 ways. First, maybe you're the first person and the coin will come up heads. Maybe you're the first person and the coin will come up tails. And maybe you're the second person and the coin has come up tails. And then you split this uncertainty 3 ways, and 2 of these ways that it might be are in the tails world. So tails is twice as likely as heads. The same basic point is true in any case where you're doing this kind of reasoning, where you split your credence across the people that you might be in light of your evidence. And then most of those people are centered in the worlds where there are more people. So then you think it's more likely that those are the world that's true. Incidentally, for this reason, SIA just falls immediately out of the premise, the probabilistic premise that if you're assessing the probability of you being any 2 centers, you can ignore the presence of other centers. And that, of course, does not commit the inverse gambler's fallacy.
So, but I'm at a little bit of a loss as to why I don't know who I am. I mean, you might think whatever my essential feature is, I can know it, and I can know that I'm that individual. So why would I not know that I'm a particular individual? In the same way that if I'm playing a slot machine in Vegas, I know whether or not I win it, independent of whether or not other people are playing it in Vegas or in the Atlantic City. So I'm at a loss as to in what sense is my identity uncertain or yet to be determined. You might think that if I have a essential condition, let's say a hexaity or essential brain or essential soul, then you might think I'm not understanding why this is not an inverse gambler's fallacy.
So it's helpful to return to the coin flip case that I was talking about. So in that case, if you're created, you can know that you, whoever you are, exist. But you don't know, so you know that this center exists. I know this center exists, but I don't know which person described in purely impersonal terms. I don't know which person that is. Just like in the coin flip case, you know that you exist, but you don't know if I'm the first guy in the world where the coin will come up heads, the first guy in the world where the coin will come up tails, or the second guy in the world where the coin will come up tails.
All right, one more slightly different question. That is, why would, if your theistic explanation is correct, why would let's take my case. Why would God create me at all? You might think, look, I'm moderately happy, moderately successful. I mean, there's lots of better people he created, and he could create lots of counterparts of these better people. So why would he, on your theistic account, why would he create me at all?
I think you're selling yourself short, Steve. I think you're pretty good, but. So, I mean, the basic story of why he'd create you. So I think part of the story will be about just whatever you say about why God allows evil will explain, whatever you think explains why there are so many bad things in the world, like, cancer and torture and so on. I think it'll also, whatever the story is, will explain why we have diminished capacities in various respects, why we have defective desires, why we are mentally defective in various respects. And so just whatever your story is for why the world is screwed up, I think this will also explain why we're screwed up.
Okay, I'll give you the last word there, Matthew, because we have to move on to the atheist first argument here, just to keep track of time.
Cool, thanks so much.
So I'm going to argue that there's no greatest possible being. If there's no greatest possible being, there's no God. Okay, so this argument comes from Nathan Bray and I. Just a quick one. It's our own argument. It has nothing to do with any group with which we're associated. Okay. Okay. So the thesis is that there's no greatest possible being. Sorry, I'm having operating difficulties here. Okay, so 4 assumptions. Number 1, what do I think a greatest possible being is? An individual is the greatest possible being if and only if it has maximal intrinsic value. The idea is that greatness is not itself a property, it's an enhancement property, so it's got to be something else. So what else is it? It's got to be something that has value that somehow we can rank in the relevant way. Presumably it's going to be moral value. It's not going to be other types of value, for example, hockey-related value or sexual value. And it's going to be intrinsic value because we think that an individual could be quite great, even if were he not to exist, there'd be even a better being. So what we care about is the person's intrinsic value, not their extrinsic value or total value, but this will work in either way. Okay. By an explanation, one thing explains the second thing, if and only if the first causes or provides a reason for the second. Okay. And independence. A thing is independent if and only if it explains itself. So that it provides it either causes itself or provides a reason for itself. Since nothing can cause itself, it's going to have to provide a reason for itself. You might also have independence in the sense of being as independent features rather than independent existence. Okay, and I would argue that the greatest possible being is independent. Why would we think that? Well, we would think that because first, you might think that our intuition supports that. Right, that it just seems better that you not depend on extrinsic beings, extrinsic events, or randomness for your existence or for your features. The modal ontological argument explicitly assumes that, and I'll return to that in a second. It assumes that independence is a great-making feature, and you might also think that if an individual existed in some worlds but not in others, and there were no explanation for this, this would violate the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, so as a background assumption here, I think the 3 best arguments that are out there for the existence of God are the cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and the modal ontological argument. The cosmological argument says that you can't have an infinite string of dependent beings, that is, beings that are explained by something that came before it. There's got to be something that explains either the sequence as a whole or that acts as a first being. And the underlying assumption is the principle of sufficient reason, that everything that exists has an explanation. Well, if the first being or the being that explains the whole sequence were unexplained, then we'd have an unexplained explainer. But principle of sufficient reason doesn't allow for that, so we have to have something that explains itself. What sort of thing could explain itself? Only something whose essence explains its existence, which is a version of the modal ontological argument. Think about the fine-tuning argument. You might think that a fine-tuning argument says that if the best thing that can happen happens and is extraordinarily unlikely, then it probably has a designer. But the same thing would apply, for example, to God. If God's the best thing that could happen and extraordinarily unlikely that he exists, then you need something to explain why he exists. The modal ontological argument does so. Standard version of the modal ontological argument says if the greatest possible being is possible, and if necessary existence is a great maker, then he exists in every possible world. And another way to put that is God's essence explains existence. That is his perfection or his supreme status, or his being the greatest possible being, includes independence, and independence explains why he exists in every possible world. So if the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument depend on the modal ontological argument, and the modal ontological argument assumes that God is the greatest possible being, then God is the greatest possible being. Okay, sorry. All right. So we think the maximally great being then is independent. Again, the arguments for are that independence relies on intuition. It seems better that a being be independent than not independent. The modological argument assumes independence. That explains why, if God's possible, he exists in every possible world. And the principle of sufficient reason also requires it. And again, by maximal greatness, you think a person is the greatest possible being if and only if he has maximal intrinsic value. Okay, so what's the argument? The argument is that the greatest possible being exists, then he's independent and is maximally intrinsically good. But no one is independent and maximally intrinsically good. Hence, there is no greatest possible being. Okay, the assumption here is that if God acts, then he acts by creating the world. So think about a sequence of endless possible worlds that he could create. The question is, which one would he create? Okay. Now, if you think that all these worlds are equally good, then he could pick it through a brute preference. For example, a bird in his ass, deciding whether he wants the right bail or the left bail, might just have a brute preference to go left, right? Nothing which causes or explains the preference. So nothing provides a reason for the preference. It's just a preference that the ass has, and you might think the same thing is true for God. It's a preference that's not backed by a reason. It has neither a cause nor a justification. You might think that God picks what world to create through creative flourish, right? Jackson Pollock. It just looks, aesthetically correct to him. But other aesthetic arrangements are just as good. It's just not his taste. Or you might think that God uses a random number generator to pick what world to create. So, for example, he might roll dice, or he might actually use a random number generator to pick which one of these worlds he creates. None of these is going to preserve his independence. Okay, so here's the idea. Let's assume God is maximal intrinsic value. That is, creating a world extrinsic to him doesn't make the overall world any better. So God has to choose, does he create a world extrinsic to him or not? Well, this would seem to be a random decision in the sense that involves a brute preference or a creative flourish or random number generator. Why? Because he wouldn't be adding any more value to the world were he to create a world extrinsic to him than if he would not. So if he's choosing between two outcomes which have equal value, then it would be random as to which one he chooses. Okay. If then God does create, there's three different type ways in which he could create a world. He could create a best possible world, if that's possible. I'm going to argue that's not. He could create one of an infinite number of worlds that are tied for the best possible world, or he could create an infinite one world in an infinite series of ever better worlds. That is, if you thought, for example, that infinity came in ever larger amounts, ever larger cardinalities, then you might think, well, he has to randomly pick which one of these worlds to create. Okay, I do not think, Nathan and I do not think there's a best possible world. Why not? Number one, if there were a best possible world, it would seem to be there would be a modal collapse, right? If that's the only world that's possible, and if God has to create that world, then all other worlds would be impossible, and hence you'd only have one possible world. You would not have the sort of possibilities we're comfortable with. Also, if there were a best possible world, then God would be morally bound to create it. He would be compelled, so he would not be responsible. In addition, it's just implausible there's a best possible world. Take the width of a mud molecule. It seems that the width of one isolated mud molecule does not either entail that, doesn't entail an intrinsic value maker, or is not entailed by one. That is, the small difference in an insignificant tiny mud molecule does not seem to make the world intrinsically better or worse. And also, if people have free will, they might use it in a worse way, which would prevent it from the best possible world, because had they acted differently, it would have been a better world. So what we're left with is God has to pick one world which is tied for the best worlds, or God has to pick one of an infinite series of worlds. But if he does that, he makes a random decision. And if he makes a random decision, then he doesn't have independence. Okay, so what are some objections someone might raise to this? Number one, someone might say, well, the greatest possible being doesn't have to have maximal intrinsic value. But then it's unclear what they think greatness is. I mean, one thing is not greater than another simplicator. It has to be greater in some way. Well, what else would we mean other than by value? And as mentioned earlier, it seems to be intrinsic value, because the sort of concern we're worried about is whether a being is greater with some feature or without it. And we're also worried about whether or not a being would be greater, would be a great being, even if were he not to exist, there would be even a better replacement being. That is, the opportunity cost of that being is significant, but he still has quite a bit of greatness. Now, you might reject independence. You might say the greatest possible being doesn't have to be independent. But this is an odd view. Number one, it's an odd view in that our intuition seems to be pretty consistently that individuals are better in terms of both existence and in terms of properties if they're not going to be dependent on other extrinsic beings, extrinsic events, or randomness. In addition, the modal ontological argument seems to presuppose this, as does the principle of sufficient reason. Well, someone might say, well, maybe God has both maximal intrinsic value and is independent. But then you have to return to how to decide whether to create an extrinsic world or not. And if he did create an extrinsic world, which one to create. So in short, I think that Nathan and I think that if God does exist in his greatest possible being, if there is a greatest possible being, then he's going to have maximal intrinsic value and he's going to be independent. But it's impossible for their being to have maximal intrinsic value and to be independent. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I have some questions about the independence premise. So it seemed like there were 3 reasons why you thought the theist needed to be committed to independence. 1, it was consulting intuitions, it just seems better. 2, it's a premise of the modal ontological argument. And 3, it's entailed by a strong version of the PSR. Was that right?
Yes.
Okay. On the consulting intuition one, so I don't have the intuition. Could you sell it to me?
Sure. I mean, imagine that you have a being that exists in some possible worlds, but not in others. You might think, okay, in virtue of what explains why he exists in the actual world. It's nothing about him that explains why he exists in all worlds or why he exists in the actual world as opposed to not existing. Similarly, imagine it's just a coin flip that explains whether a really good being, a really evil being. You think, well, there's something lacking, some sort of self-explanatory feature. So that's the intuition. Leaving aside the intuition, imagine that you thought the modal ontological argument was sound. You think that, look, something about the mere possibility of the greatest possible being explains, well, if he's possible, then he has to be necessary. Well, what would explain that? Well, what would explain that is only if necessity is itself a great maker. But if necessity is a great maker, what's great about being necessary? It's going to be something like independence. So even if you don't have the intuition, so long as the other 2 arguments depend on the modal ontological argument, that's the reason we should accept independence as a great maker, if you're a theist.
Sure. So, I mean, as a theist, I'm agnostic about the soundness of the modal ontological argument because I'm agnostic about the claim that God is metaphysically necessary. So, and I'm not convinced that the argument that I'm about to give or the argument that Matthew gave depended or was parasitic on the modal ontological argument. So maybe that'll be something to come to maybe when you question our arguments. But on the intuition point, so it seems like the thing that makes you squeamish about the claim that God exists in some possible worlds but not others is something like God's existence depends on luck, and how could the greatest possible being's existence depend on luck? But I think when you get lucky, that's a good thing. And it's not clear to me why it would detract from the greatness of the being, so that's one challenge. So what's wrong with just getting lucky? The second challenge is it seems like even if independence is a great making feature, it's going to be something that's extrinsically valuable and not intrinsically valuable, partly because it has to do with relations to other possible worlds. But it seemed like in your characterization of the greatest possible being or a maximally perfect being, you're only considering intrinsic great-making properties. So even if independence is a great-making property, which I deny, why isn't it an extrinsic value as opposed to an intrinsic one?
Good. So great points. So what about the 2 arguments you give and in general? Why should you be committed to the modal ontological argument? I claim that you are. Number 1, I mean, this is going back to the last feature. I claim that Matthew committed the inverse Gamblers fallacy and that the argument didn't work. I'm going to argue that psychophysical harmony has problems, that really what you need is the cosmological and fine-tuning argument. Now, for the cosmological and fine-tuning argument to work, you have to explain why there's no unexplained explainer, right? If you think you have the principle of sufficient reason, or you have to explain why there's no undesigned designer. Now, how could you do that if you didn't have someone explain himself? I don't see how you could, in other words, if you rely on either of those two arguments, then you're committed to the modal ontological argument. Now you might say I'm agnostic on it, and you might be, but I think, again, I mean, you're a smart guy, but to your discredit, you're committed to it whether you like it or not. And so why think independence is a great making feature? Well, you might think that independence is an intrinsic feature. It's something like it's part of being supreme or having maximal intrinsic value. It's part of what it means to have maximal intrinsic value, is that you're not dependent on sort of anything else. You're self-contained. And that seems to be an intrinsic feature. Both your existence and your features, depend on only intrinsic, let's say, parts or intrinsic properties.
So, I mean, when you were describing why independence has to be the best possible being would have to have independence, you were describing why it might be good to have independence. Now, maybe all else equal, having independence is good. But it seems like if your argument is right, what we should just think is, well, there's no possible being that satisfies independence and is in other respects maximally good. Maybe there's no possible being satisfying independence. So then if there's no possible being that has this property, except maybe, abstract objects, then, it's no slight on God that he doesn't have this property. Nothing has this property. And so the very greatest being would have this property. In other words, I think if your argument is an argument for why the greatest possible being just couldn't satisfy independence, then it seems that we could just say, okay, maybe the greatest possible being doesn't satisfy independence, even because satisfying independence is an impossible property for a being like that for the reasons you described.
Good. So it's a great point. Like, haven't we learned something about theism rather than showing that atheism is true? In the same way, if you show that, look, God doesn't have responsibility, right? That let's say certain responsibility is impossible, and therefore God's not responsible. You think, okay, well, we learned something about God. We haven't shown that atheism is true. But if your argument lives or dies on the modal ontological argument, and the modal ontological argument entails independence, then it carries with it the fact that the arguments for God's existence collapse. So, Nathan, I'll let you in a second. What you'd have to show is that the cosmological and fine-tuning argument do not depend on the modal ontological argument, or the modal ontological argument does not depend on independence. So I like your point, and I'm highly sympathetic to it. I just don't think it works given the structure of the arguments.
Could I just add an additional I'm going to make a literature move because that's the salsa that I was trained in. See, Amos loves these. I told him I was practicing zingers last night. So here's another consideration that you might think. It may be persuasive, it may not. So take the argument from arbitrary limits, right? You might think something like, well, like if God were to fail to be perfect in some worlds, right? Because you said something, Amos, where you were like, what's wrong with being lucky, right? And then you might think that being lucky is an arbitrary limit, right? Because if there's some world where you don't max out the properties, then you'd be like, well, I can imagine a better being that maxes out the properties in that world. And so having the one less, right, would constitute an arbitrary limit. I don't know. That's just a thought. It's a different way of trying to arrive at a similar result.
So if I can just respond to that point, and then I guess we can kick it back to see if he has further points.
Go ahead. Yeah, then go back to Steve. Yeah.
So my objection is just going to be, it's a limit on a being that doesn't exist in the relevant world. But what we care about is the being that exists in the actual world. So if it's true that there's some possible world over which God is sovereign, but it doesn't exist, then I'm not sure why I'm supposed to care about that.
Yeah, so, I mean, here's one way to think about the concern. Imagine that you thought that there's an infinite number of ever larger infinities of cardinality, and you think God has maximal intrinsic value. But there is no maximum. Why is there no maximum? Because, again, you think there's an endless sequence of cardinalities. And you think, okay, well, then maybe God is not maximally intrinsically good. He's not the greatest possible being. Well, if you want to say that God's not the greatest possible being, that's a pretty strong move, because a lot of the ways in which we think about God as the supreme being or the perfect being seems to involve something like his being the greatest possible being. So I'm not sure why the independence, if you want to say, look, I don't think God's independent, how are you getting, even if that were the case, you do have a problem with the arbitrariness. And you particularly have a problem with arbitrariness if you think that God is the greatest possible being. Matthew, you wanted to jump in earlier, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think if you think the independence criteria can't be satisfied, I was thinking of that as a reason why the greatest possible being wouldn't have that property. So in other words, if you think that just there is no possible being that satisfies independence, then it's this impossible property. Maybe it's an impossible property where if you imagine per impossible way that one had it, it would be good. But if, as your arguments show, it's an impossible property to have alongside the other greatest making features, then maybe we should just say, okay, maybe you can't have that. And so the greatest possible being doesn't have that property because you have to give up that property in order to have all these other great properties.
But then here's a second way to see why you think independence might be important. Imagine you think there's an infinite sequence of ever larger infinities. And you think that, which by the way, I don't think, but imagine you did think that. And that you think that God has an infinite amount of value, but there's always, there's always possible beings that have greater value than God did. Why? Because, for any amount of value he has, there's a possible being that could have more. It would seem to fall from that not only do you think that independence, that it's not enough to say that independence is not a great making feature. You have to say there's no greatest possible being. So that would force you to the view that say, okay, the greatest possible being is impossible, but maybe God is not a greatest possible being. So that's the position you'd be forced into by allowing, by saying, yeah, there's no problem with independence. Again, and you have some sympathy for these and the sequences of greater cardinality and infinities.
Can I just jump in and ask? So you don't have sympathy for the view that there's an ever greater hierarchy of infinite cardinalities. Just a quick question: whatever you say to deny that claim, can't we say it and then rescue our view from your argument?
So sure. I mean, that would be one way to rescue it, but there could be other ties, right? Imagine you have different possible beings and they have different preferences with regard to some completely obscure fact, like the optimal color of the puffin's beak, where one wants it orange and one wants it blue. And so we have different possible properties. And you say, okay, which of these, given that these are different possible beings, which of these is the greatest possible being? Well, the same problem applies, right? It seems to be an arbitrariness feature. But if you think there's a single greatest possible being, particularly if you think this on the basis of the modal ontological argument, then that's going to produce problems because there are going to be different competitors for the greatest possible being. So it doesn't have to handle the infinite sequence. It can also occur via ties of equally good beings with different preferences.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify, neither Matthew or I accept the modal ontological argument, or at least we don't think that we're assuming it in our argument. So maybe we should wait till the Q&A period when you're grilling me or something to find out why I'm assuming both the modal ontological argument and the teleological argument and the cosmological argument in the presentation of a different argument.
Oh, you're going to learn today, Amos. You're going to learn today.
Well, I mean, just again, the argument is, I mean, it's a straightforward argument that the cosmological and fine-tuning arguments depend on the modal ontological argument. So unless there were like and the other argument is both your and Matthew's arguments, which are really powerful and interesting, the great arguments, by the way, still they assume that the notion of the greatest possible being or God is coherent. If it's incoherent, these arguments are going to fail. And I want to claim that the central feature you're invoking, the notion of God and the notion of the greatest possible being, is incoherent. So that's why it fails. Because if you're invoking an explanation that involves an incoherent notion, something that can't possibly refer to the world, then the argument fails. And I claim that's exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, so I want to. So maybe this will be of more interest to me than to the audience. But I think this argument doesn't have any force against me in particular. Where basically my leaning is, I think God is contingent, and then I think God's essential property is being a limitless mind, and maybe that leads to him being the greatest possible being, if there is one. Maybe, and if there's no greatest possible being, then it just leads to him being, maybe tied for the greatest possible being. Maybe just like very, very good if there's no greatest one, where he's just supposed to bring back what's best if there is a best thing, and if not. So against me, if you have my commitments, do you think this argument has any force? Maybe we could talk about, maybe my commitments are really implausible, but on independent grounds. But
well, I think all of your arguments have force.
I just want to say real quick, we'll also give Stephen the last word here, so then we can go to the next argument.
Okay. So Matthew, I like all of your arguments. I guess they always have force. But no, I think that the problem is when you allow in brute facts, they tend to be promiscuous. They go all over the place. So if you want to say, well, why does God exist in the actual world but not in all these possible worlds? You say, well, there's no explanation. It just is what it is. You say, well, why is God great in alpha but terrible in beta and even worse in gamma in worlds? And you say, look, there's no explanation. That's the way things are. Well, what's to stop a contagion of brute facts? What happened to that Pop-Tart that was on my plate? Well, it disappeared. Well, what explains why it disappeared? Nothing. It's just a brute fact. That is, once you let in brute facts, it keeps them from spreading like wildfire.
Wait, don't you believe in brute facts?
No.
No. Well, I mean, if you think that, I think that maybe there's another good theistic argument. But
Okay, that was great. Okay, so let's move on to Amos then.
I'm going to be presenting the argument from psychophysical luck. It's just one part of a cumulative case that, once conjoined to Matthews, shows that if you want to theory mog, you're going to have to godmax. So it starts with a conceivability premise. I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument, that zombies are conceivable. So zombies are creatures that are microphysically identical to conscious creatures like us, but there's nothing going on upstairs. They have no qualia. It's nothing it's like to be them. And similarly, I'll assume that things like inverts, people who have had their color spectrum inverted or their orientation of pain and pleasure inverted, are at least conceivable. Whether it's possible, for now, will be left an open question. So this amounts to assuming that type A physicalism is false, also known as a priori physicalism. A priori physicalism is the view that there's no epistemic gap effectively between the physical and the mental. I'm going to assume that's wrong. So I'm going to give a litany of puzzles. I'm going to say these puzzles are all broadly independent from one another. And then I'm going to say that theism provides a really neat unified explanation, whereas the most plausible naturalistic hypotheses will have to target each of these puzzles individually and try to solve them on their own terms. And so theism at least gets an advantage insofar as it can provide a neat, unified, elegant solution. The first one has to do with the order of pain and pleasure. So observation. Pain states and pleasure states occur, roughly in a rational order. So pain is typically induced by, bad, harmful stuff in our environment. Pleasure is typically induced by good, beneficial stuff in our environment. But conceivably, creatures that are physically like us could have been pain and pleasure inverts. So holding all of the physical facts that hold of the actual world the same, the psychophysical laws conceivably could have been such that, say, whenever I touched a hot stove or smashed my face with a hammer, I'd be on cloud 9. And then I'd, compulsively withdraw my hand and stop hitting my face with a hammer. So actually, my behavior would be just as adaptive, but I'd be feeling pleasure while I was doing it. Now, that doesn't sound so bad. But similarly, imagine that whenever I was being tickled, I felt the pain of being waterboarded, and then I was disposed to cry out compulsively, keep going. That would be very bad, and it would be irrational. So in the actual world, our behavior is rationalized by the quality of our phenomenal states, but conceivably, it might not have been. So these might have been in the wrong order. It also could have been that our phenomenal states were just neutral, even though our bodies behave in exactly the same way. Second, there's a puzzle, an epistemic puzzle. So I'm going to assume that external world skepticism is false. So we know that the external world exists, and that it is roughly as it appears to us. For example, I know that I have two hands, at least partly because I can see them. Now, there's a pretty good correlation between our phenomenal presentation of the world and how it actually is. There are exceptions. There are hallucinations, for example. But I take that to just be part of the problem of evil, and so not part of the data we're considering. But conceivably, the psychophysical laws could have been such that for any creatures like us, our phenomenal presentations of the world would be way out of whack with the way things actually were. So, for example, we would just seen static instead of the external world, and our bodies would behave in exactly the same way, dodging bullets, running from tigers, hunting prey, and so forth. I'll go quickly through this one because I may run out of time, but conceivably, our verbal reports say about our experiences might have been mismatched with those reports and with the contents of those reports in kind of a systematic way. So conceivably, the psychophysical laws could have been such that the content of every verbal report of the form "I experienced X" could have been false, since the content of the experience was actually Y, where Y isn't X. So every time I felt compelled to assert I see the color red, what I was actually seeing was the color yellow. But things aren't actually that way. So when I intend to assert something that reflects the quality of my experiences or the content of my experiences, I can do so reliably. Conceivably, things didn't have to be this way. Finally, there's a fourth puzzle that Joe Schmidt has discovered recently. Many are calling it psychonomic harmony. So just to kind of grease the wheels for this one, imagine a board game that has the wrong instructions for the stuff that's in the box. So the instructions say to move red counters according to a dice roll, but inside the box is only a timer, and instead of dice, there are just cards instead of counters. So that would be an unfortunate mismatch because we wouldn't know how to play the game. Conceivably, the psychophysical laws could have been this way with respect to the contents of the physical universe. So the psychophysical laws could have mapped lucky conscious states onto schmains instead of brains, but the laws of physics could only produce brains, and so as a result, brains never pair up to lucky psychophysical laws. They either pair up to nothing or they pair up to the unlucky ones. And this is an independent puzzle that blocks some of the potential responses people might give to the previous three. So just zooming out, like, what's the meta puzzle? It's puzzling why our phenomenal lives are interesting and rich. So conceivably holding fixed all of the physical facts, our phenomenal lives could have been uninteresting and banal or really terrible. And that's the thing that I'm claiming is more likely under theism than under atheism. So one might try and solve all of the previous puzzles individually by adopting kind of tendentious philosophical theses that individually address the problems of, say, semantic harmony and the problem of normative harmony, which is about the pain and pleasure mismatch. But theism is just one tendentious thesis, and it solves all of them in one fell swoop. Before I say quickly why I think it does so, I'll just go through some objections that people are definitely having in the audience. So you might just think, this is so silly, evolution immediately solves the problem. But evolution doesn't help at all once you understand the problem. So on many metaphysical accounts of natural laws, evolution couldn't have selected for lucky psychophysical laws in principle. So by analogy, even if it would have been adaptive to run faster than the speed of light, or pass through walls, or fly in crazy ways, evolution couldn't have selected for new physical laws to make room for creatures like that. And so similarly, if the psychophysical laws were such that they just like prevented organisms in our universe from being able to like pair onto the lucky ones, then evolution just wouldn't be able to select for lucky psychophysical laws because those laws just might not have applied to the universe. And similarly, if you adopt a more Humean picture where laws of nature are just descriptions of natural regularities, the puzzle just relocates, right? So why are these psychophysical regularities so fortunate? You might think, secondly, that physicalism helps. Physicalism doesn't help. At least if we're dealing with a posteriori physicalism, the version that accepts that zombies are conceivable, that inverts are conceivable, that there's an epistemic gap between the mental and the physical. So if dominant versions of physicalism is true, then the psychophysical laws could not have differed in a metaphysical possibility sense, holding fixed all of the physical facts. That's true. But if different psychophysical regularities are conceivable, then there's still a puzzle about epistemic probability. So the prior epistemic probability of psychophysical luck would be vanishingly remote, right? Like the prior probability that the necessary psychophysical facts would just be this way is super unlikely. And so for that reason, the bare hypothesis of physicalism doesn't predict psychophysical luck at all. In an epistemic sense, it's still just as unlikely. Now, you could conjoin physicalism with some more specific hypothesis about what the contents of the psychophysical laws are. So physicalism is true, and the psychophysical laws are necessarily this way, but then you just tank the prior of the theory. In contrast, theism plus the claim that the psychophysical laws are contingent does predict, or at least probabilify, the fact of psychophysical harmony. And so atheism plus physicalism won't help in a way that theism plus the view that the psychophysical laws are contingent can. Maybe I'll get back to the slide later if we have time. Finally, I'll just say a bit about, in broad strokes, why I think theism helps. So on theism, I claim it's not so terribly unlikely that a good and or loving God would want to draft fortunate psychophysical laws so that we could learn things, engage with the world, assert what we intend to assert, etc. And so since theism, I claim, makes generic good things predictions, it makes good things, not terribly unlikely. It's not terribly unlikely that God would, for reasons of value and or love for his creatures potentially, ensure that we live in a psychophysically lucky world. Finally, I just said that theism helps. What is theism? Theism, the hypothesis that God exists, where minimally God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good person who is responsible for setting things up as they are. I don't commit to which precise cashing out of the God hypothesis is the most intrinsically probable, partly because I don't know. I'm just undecided on the question. So you might think it's the greatest epistemic possible being. You might think it's a maximal God or a perfect being or an omnipotent being, a la Richard Swinburne, or an unlimited mind, a la Matthew Adelstein, or the Catholic thing, whatever that is. And I submit that the disjunction of the most intrinsically probable theistic hypotheses that probabilify psychophysical harmony is more intrinsically probable than the disjunction of the most intrinsically probable atheistic hypotheses that also probabilify psychophysical harmony, such that the fact of psychophysical harmony confirms theism over atheism. Yield the rest of my time if I have any.
Great presentation, Amos, as always. I really appreciate it. So I kind of have a separate issue.
Thanks, Steve.
Leave aside the thinking. I'm concerned about the existence of consciousness in general. And I'm wondering if this is kind of a divine command theory. So you might think that, look, the subject of consciousness is going to be an animal, a brain, a soul, or some conjunctive entity like a hylomorphic entity. Now, is that something that God decides, or is that something that is true independent of God's decision?
Which theory of mind is true? Hylomorphism versus dualism?
No, I'm not asking which theory of mind you think is true. I'm just asking, is the fact, let's just say that the brain is the bear of consciousness. It doesn't matter which one it is, but let's just say it's the brain.
Okay.
Is it your view that that is true independent of God, or that it's dependent on God? And if it were to be dependent on God, is that something that's possible independent of what God decrees, or is that impossible but for God's decreeing it?
Good question. Right. So the reason I asked about whether your question should be interpreted as like which theory is true in the background is that it might be that there are independent metaphysical facts constraining which kinds of minds that God can create. So like suppose it's just true that minds can only be souls, or they can only be hylomorphic souls, or they can only be brains for the sake of argument. In the background, that I claim will be independent of theism. So there'll just be a set of facts about what's metaphysically possible, and God could only select within that range. Since I claim that God is responsible for the existence of all the minds that there are apart from his own, then I'm going to say like it couldn't be the case that your mind existed independent of God's decree or creative act or whatever, but like which kind of mind he could have created you as having, that may and will probably is constrained by like which theory of mind is true, because I take it that some will be metaphysically impossible and some will be metaphysically
But if that were to be correct, and again, I mean, I like your theory, but if it were to be correct that the subject of consciousness is independent of God's decision-making, then why wouldn't the thinking also be independent of God's decision-making? That is, given that a brain with a certain neuronal structure, for example, is the thinker, again, it could be the animal, could be a soul, could be a hylomorphic entity. Let's just assume it's the brain. And that metaphysics constrains it to that consciousness is had by and only by a brain. Then why wouldn't you think this would not also constrain thinking? That is, what explains the existence of the subject of consciousness would also explain its content, and also would explain how it syncs with things in the external world.
Yeah, good. So going in, let's say we're neutral between which theory of mind is true. So we're agnostic between physicalism and versions of non-physicalism. On plausible interpretations of physicalism, the psychophysical correlations are going to be necessary, and so God won't be able to explain why the psychophysical laws are the way they are, given the metaphysical facts. So conditional on the view that phenomenal states are identical to brain states or something, God won't have any leeway over that. But what I take this to show is that by the end of the argument, we should have strongly updated against those theories of mind in favor of theories of mind on which the pairings of phenomenal states and brain states is going to be a contingent matter that God can decide between, right? So it might be that like God can't decide to make one thing that's identical to itself not identical to itself. Like that's going to be impossible. But if there are two things, like A and B, God is going to be able to control what the relationship between A and B are, where A and B are distinct. And so I'm thinking, even if we're agnostic going in about whether the psychophysical laws are metaphysically necessary, by the end, you get an update in favor of the view that they're contingent. Why? Because it's only the view that they're contingent plus theism that predicts or probabilifies psychophysical harmony, whereas theism plus the view that they're necessary doesn't predict or probabilify psychophysical harmony.
Could I come in? All right. So first of all, I just want to say that I'm really enjoying the discussion, and
Me too.
I like this argument that you hallucinated. But anyway, so I think it's really good. So I'm going to ask a question, and I wrote it out. So apologies for reading it, but I want to make sure that I get the verbiage exactly right. I have a few things prepared. So here's my question. If we're entertaining scenarios where we could just kind of randomly hook up mental phenomenon and behavioral dispositions, shouldn't we most expect, given theism, that there would be no harmful mental experiences, since we can get avoidance behavior from positive or neutral mental reactions? Why can't something induce the behavioral profile of pain without hurting?
Good question. So I'm not sure that on theism we would expect no pain. So you might think that like the positive arguments in favor of some of the greater goods theodicies have at least some force, even if they don't explain nearly enough of the evil that exists in the world. So you might think that there's some value in creatures like us having courage, for example, and that requires the experience of fear, blah, blah, blah. I agree, though, that the amount of harmful conscious experiences that we actually observe in the world far outstrips what we would expect on the hypothesis of theism. And so I just grant that that's a vast amount of evidence against my theory. And all I claim is that the positive evidence for theism, the many independently converging lines of evidence that I think favor it, just outweighs that counter evidence. Right? But I grant the point that the bad stuff we experience is evidence against a good God.
And in fact, there's a name for this argument that the bad stuff we experience is evidence
Here we
against the
go.
existence of God. It's called the problem
What
of
is it?
evil, and it's the most famous atheistic argument. So I feel like you can't just like keep like cross applying the problem
here
of
we
evil to every theistic argument.
Right, this is what Matthew's here to do. He's here to call balls and strikes. He's the judge. Which I very much appreciate. But yeah, so look, like, kind of asking like if this is a problem that you have. But as a side note, Matthew, I very much take the point. Yeah, about me not using the problem of evil and then employing an argument like this. It's a very good point. So yeah, I think that's just the first question that I would like to ask, if that's all right. And I take your answer very seriously, and I think it's a good answer. So the next question that I wanted to ask kind of has to do with physicalism a little bit, because I remember, I don't know what slide it was, but you said that physicalism isn't going to solve things. So let me lead with sort of like a prosecutorial question. Do you think that there could be necessary a posteriori facts?
Yep.
Like, okay, so do you think that, for instance, gold having the atomic number 79 is like, would be a good example of that? Like, it's not a fluke, for instance, that gold has the atomic number 79? Okay, good.
Yeah.
All right, good. You would agree with that. So now here's my question. Why doesn't the physicalist, right, and I think that this is the standard definition of physicalism, think something somewhat similar? So here's the dialectic that I'm imagining. You go to the physicalist and you say, why do certain phenomenal states play the functional roles that they do? Is it a fluke, right? And I think I'm using the term fluke because Philip Goff uses this terminology. And the physicalist says it's necessary. It's a necessary a posteriori effect. We just don't know. And then so maybe you're going to respond with saying like, well, look, we can't know that a priori. Sorry. But then here's the response. But there are lots of necessities we can't know a priori. And we don't infer that they're flukes, like the one that you just admitted to. So what I'm confused about is it's not a fluke because it's a necessity. Even on some functionalist accounts, right? You would agree with that, right? Like some functionalists are going to say that. I mean, and that's a standard view.
Of course, that's what all a posteriori physicalists will say about their own view.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I mean, what I'm trying to point out here is that like the psychophysical links, I mean, it doesn't seem like a fluke that they happen to be linked up in the way that they're linked up, because you might think that it's necessary that they're linked in the way that they're linked, that the phenomenal properties and the physical properties have these kinds of relations. Oh, and then I'll go to Steve.
I just want to jump into this. You might think,
should I just respond to Nathan and then I'll...
Go ahead.
The same argument.
No.
Okay. Yeah, fine. So nothing in the argument relies on the ideology in the Aquinean sense of flukes, right? So it might be a constitutive fluke, these metaphysically necessary facts, so constitutive luck in that broad sense, where even metaphysically necessary things can count as lucky. But like, I don't need to appeal to the verbiage of flukes or luck at all. All I need to claim is that the observation of psychophysical harmony is more expected on the hypothesis of theism plus the view that psychophysical laws are contingent than it is on the hypothesis of atheism plus a posteriori physicalism, or indeed on the hypothesis of theism plus a posteriori physicalism. Does that reply make sense, or is there?
Yeah,
still
that reply is good, and I think it's a nice one against that specific objection. The only worry that I have, which I think you can anticipate, is that reply, which goes into the probability stuff, is going to fall to which objection? Anybody in the audience? The divine psychology worries that
I was really hoping that you get into that, but
we can get into that. We can talk about that until the cows come home. But I'm going to go to Steve.
I'm curious as to why the physics doesn't prevent inverse, pain and pleasure systems. So you might think, look, pain receptors in the skin, they link up to the neural system in a certain way, and the neural system links up to the brain in a certain way. And you said, look, God could have hooked these things up differently, but not without changing the physics of the whole system. So I'm not sure I'm following exactly how your argument works. Mm-hmm. You might think, look, God could have restructured us very differently. Okay, well, maybe that's true. But given our structure, I mean, look, there are certain ways which set off those, the pain receptors in our skin, and those link up in a particular way to our central nervous system, and those in turn link up to our brain in a particular way. And we began by agreeing that metaphysics rather than God sets the nature of the thinker. So why aren't you denying the basic physics of human physiology?
I'm granting all the best current physics of human physiology, right? So I'm not imagining that like God is tinkering with any of the physical facts. All I'm thinking is that he's tinkering with the psychophysical facts. Okay, so for the sake of argument, entertain a theory in the philosophy of mind on which the relationship between what is felt and what goes on in the brain is contingent, right? So for the sake of argument, assume that dualism is true. So imagine that we have an immaterial soul and that there's some relationship of causal laws going on between the brain and the soul. Okay. Holding fixed all of the facts about the body, you might think that God could set up the law-like connection between the soul and the brain in such a way that every time, my C fibers fire, I felt overwhelming pleasure, and the inverse for pain, right? And then I'm thinking theism plus one of those theories of minds on which the relationship between qualia and brain states is contingent, that will probabilify psychophysical harmony. So I'm not having to imagine that God is tinkering with the physical facts. I'm saying he's tinkering with the psychophysical facts, conditional on one of these contingentist views being true.
So I think that's a great point, and I think that's a great point when it comes to dualism. I don't think it's a great point when it comes to animalism or brain theory. That is, I don't see how you can have contingent, given the way these things are structured. I don't see. I mean, you might think, look, I mean, in certain brains, you can imagine that God has the thinking occur in the insulating cells, the glial cells, rather than the neurons. Well, I'm not sure that's possible because of the physics, the way in which the neural cells operate, and the way in which the glial cells operate. Given that, I'm not sure the same thing isn't true with regard to pain receptors and the way the pain receptors link up with the brain.
But I mean, you could have the same glial cells and whatever, and then just have different paired mental states.
Well, so I don't think that's responsive to. So he's thinking that by the end of the argument, I need the conclusion to be compatible with animalism and brain theory in order for the argument to be dialectically effective. But that's not what's going on, at least as I see it. So going into the argument, you can have high credence in physicalist versions of brain theory and animalism. But by the end of the argument, you're supposed to have got decisive disconfirmation for those views, right? So going into the argument, you can be like 99% confident that a physicalist version of animalism or the brain theory is true. But then on observing that given that hypothesis, it's super unlikely that we would have psychophysical harmony, but much less unlikely on the hypothesis that God exists and that your physicalist animalism or brain theory was wrong, then we get confirmation for the conjunction of theism plus the view that the psychophysical laws are contingent. And so by the end of the argument, we've disconfirmed animalism and the brain theory, but I don't need to assume that it's false going in. You can go in assuming it's really probable, but then by the end, you're supposed to have given up those views.
Could I just come in on this point?
Yeah, sure.
So just to return to the initial thing, when you say the psychophysical harmony is super unlikely, or that you're supposed to come away with that, do you think that it's super unlikely, or that the physicalists should think it's super unlikely that the phenomenal properties play the functional roles that they do? So for instance, like it's super unlikely that pain plays the role that it does.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's like,
But then going back, I mean, the physicalist thinks that it's necessary that they play the role that it does. So the probability is going to be 1.
So you'll be
necessary.
Right, but I'm dealing with epistemic probabilities. So this is an example that you will hate, but it will resonate with you. So you'll understand what's going on.
Go ahead, Amos. It's a friendly, yeah, go ahead.
So take one of these awesome theistic evidence scenarios. So we discover that the atoms are humming God's name, and that like the Psalms are written in biblical Hebrew and the stars. And then suppose that before discovering this, you had a really high credence, 99%, but not quite certain in a necessitarianism, the view that like everything about the physical world is necessarily so. Okay. On observing this really surprising data, you would think, okay, given my necessitarianism, the probability that the universe is the way it is 1, but the epistemic probability that it's this particular way is not 1. Right? It's like very, very low. On the other hand, the probability that the universe is this way, if necessitarianism is false and God exists, is not vanishingly low. And so you get disconfirmation of the view that the surprising fact is metaphysically necessary.
Okay, we have to move on. I'm so sorry. I know you wanted to respond there. Okay, well,
that's fine. It's totally fine. Don't worry about it. Maybe we could come back after, and we could have a whole section on awesome theistic evidence if they want to stay on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's just close it out. Last argument.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I've really been enjoying the discussion so far. I think it's been very invigorating and thought-provoking. So I'm going to give the responsibility argument. I think Amos covered all the disclaimers, so I don't actually have to go through this. So next slide. Part 1, thesis. Okay, so here what I'm going to do is I'm going to argue that God is not morally responsible. Steve and I developed these arguments previously. I'm just going to rehash them, and then we're going to jump right into the discussion. All right, so these are the terms and conditions of the argument, okay? So first, what is responsibility? One sec. So first, we think responsibility is a basic property. What's a basic property? A basic property is a property that's not analyzable into constituent parts. Example, think about the color yellow. See the highlighted stuff that's yellow. It's not, you can't break it down into further components. So we think it's a basic property. Now, what's the bearer of responsibility? Good question. A bearer of responsibility is someone is responsible for and only for what they decide or what they choose. Okay. Another key notion that's going to be important is libertarianism. Okay. This is not the political type, not Mike Humer. Here we're talking about libertarianism and responsibility. So libertarianism is just the combination of two views, right? So incompatibilism and indeterminism. You smush those two things together, you got libertarianism. And then within libertarianism, we have two views, right? So we have leeway, we have source. Okay, so leeway just says that, you have the choice between alternatives, right? And that's a genuine choice. So J.P. Moreland thinks something like this. And then you have source, which is just you're the ultimate source of your actions. Okay, so leeway, source, we have libertarianism, definition of responsibility. Those are the terms and conditions. Now, part 3, argument, subthesis. We kind of went over this a little bit earlier, so it's going to be a little bit of rehashing, so I'm going to kind of whiz by this part. But God has his psychology, essentially. Why think this? Steve covered this earlier. But one of the reasons to think this is that, look, God is the greatest possible being. If God's going to be the greatest possible being, then he has to have his fantastic psychology in all the possible worlds. Why? Let's take a case. So imagine that we have Hercules, and he's like really good, okay? But he's only good in, let's say, all the possible worlds but one. Okay, can we imagine a better being? Yeah, we can. Yahweh, right? And he's great in all the possible beings, including the one that Hercules isn't good in. So when we're looking at the two beings, Hercules on the one hand, Yahweh on the other, we have to make a determination, right? Which being is greater? Seems like we're going to go with Yahweh. Why? Because he has that psychology essentially. And by essentially, we mean necessarily. So he has it in all possible worlds. What does this show? He doesn't have those properties incidentally. He doesn't have those great making features randomly. He doesn't have it as a result of external factors. It's baked into him. It's not contingent. And so this shows, at least in part, although I know Amos and Matthew are going to push back on this, that God doesn't have a dependent psychology. It's independent. And so independence might be a great maker because God possesses all great makers. Okay. So with that subthesis established, or at least defended, we're now going to move on to the next part of the argument. Right. So here's the basic argument. You can see these little arrows. So here's how we're going to lay this out. Number one, God's thoughts and actions are compelled. Number two, if premise one, then God is not responsible. Hence, God is not responsible. We're going to have to go into a little bit of detail here. And what I want to do is just go over some brief technical details. Then I'm going to give some cases to illustrate or to concretize things. And then I'm going to launch into some objections. So first, let's think about compulsion. There's a picture of Peter Van Inwagen, your favorite philosopher. So here's the idea. If you have a compelled psychology, and that psychology means that you're locked into doing the things that you do. You can't revise the psychology. The psychology is, in a sense, foisted upon you. Then you're not responsible for that psychology. Now, if the choice flows from that psychology, then you're not responsible for the choice. Hence, you wouldn't be responsible for the choice. Now, recall, we think that the bearer of responsibility is the choice or the decision. So a person is responsible for and only for a decision. So this is where it's going to be really critical. Now, in order to do this, we're going to give something like a 4-case argument. And I think that this is going to be a really good illustration of exactly where we're going. So here's the case. So let's take case one, manipulation. So suppose that we have Patty Hearst. Now, let's leave aside the question of whether or not she was actually brainwashed. Some people contest this, but let's just take the case as given. So we have the Sudanese Liberation Army, and they snatch up this wealthy heiress at UC Berkeley, and they manipulate her into having a psychology, radical Marxist psychology, and then she goes and she robs a bank. Okay, she goes and she robs a bank. Now, here's the question. Given the fact that she was totally manipulated and brainwashed, do we think that she's responsible for the subsequent decision? We claim that the answer is no, because she didn't control the psychology, and she didn't control the choice that flowed from the psychology. Notice that she's failing a key condition for responsibility here, which is the control condition. She does not control the psychology, and she doesn't control the choice that flows from the psychology. Take the next case, instant creation. Suppose that God creates Patty Hearst like an instant being, zaps her into existence. Okay, well, would this being be responsible? We claim that the answer is no. Why? Because, again, the psychology is foisted upon her. She didn't choose it. And so if she immediately goes, and then robs the bank, she's not responsible for the choice because she has the psychology, and then the choice immediately flows from the psychology, and she doesn't have control over the psychology. Here's the next case. Essential property. So imagine an essentially configured Patty Hearst. So Patty Hearst essentially has the Sudanese Liberation Army psychology. Now, here's the question. The question is that Patty Hearst responsible? We say that the answer is no. Why? Because she's locked in, as the Gen Zers say, she's locked into that psychology. She can't step outside of it to revise it. And so whatever flows from it, she's not responsible for, because she doesn't control the psychology. She doesn't control what flows from it. What we're going to argue, and this is like kind of a case for, is that God is similar to the essential property case, meaning that God is essentially locked into doing the morally good action. He doesn't have the capacity to sin. And so just as Patty Hearst, the essential property Patty Hearst, isn't responsible, so is God not responsible. Okay. So here's the argument summary. God's thoughts and actions are compelled. Why think that? God has his psychology essentially because he's maximally great. That's assumption one. Assumption two, God's psychology alone generates his actions. God's psychology alone generates his actions. And given those two things, God's thoughts and actions are compelled because they result from and only from something that he doesn't control, which is his psychology. Now, if that's the case, then he's not responsible, because if his thoughts and actions are compelled, then he's not responsible. Hence, God is not responsible. Okay, with that, some objections. We're going to whiz through these. Source incompatibilism. Look, what is the idea here? Well, he's the ultimate source of his actions, so he's responsible. Here's the argument. God is the sole source of his actions, therefore he's responsible. Why should we reject this? Well, even if he's the source of his actions, even if source incompatibilism is true, compulsion's compulsion. Take the Patty Hearst case. Even if Patty Hearst is the sole source of her actions, right? They flow from her. It's still difficult to see in what sense she's responsible, because she didn't control the psychology and she didn't control the choice that flowed from the psychology. Okay, we could get into some of these other objections later. Next, compatibilism. So there are two main theories here: guidance control and mesh. You might think that God has guidance control, he's reasons responsive, or you might think that God's higher order desires are properly aligned into a mesh. And if you think that, look, he satisfies the compatibilist requirements, therefore he's responsible. Here's the problem: compulsion's compulsion. Even if you had a being and you were thinking in the compatibilist terms who was perfectly, manipulated, they wouldn't control the meshed psychology. And if they don't control the meshed psychology, they don't control what flows from it. And so to this extent, it's still responsibility undermining. Another thing to note is that compatibilism contradicts a lot of the other things that are important or that we find important, such as the problem of evil, soul-making theodicy, and the justification for heaven and hell. So the theist is going to have some issues there. And also you might wonder why compatibilism for God, but then libertarian free will for humans. It's a little bit of a weird asymmetry. Next, here's Perry Hendricks, and this is the so what objection. So what that God doesn't have responsibility? Well, here we're going to ratchet up the cost. This is a radical revision of the notion of God. It's difficult to see how you could have a really nice version of worship here. How do you worship God if he isn't ultimately responsible for things? Second, do you really want to step for God? Do you want a God that's basically like a robot? We prefer relating to beings that are free and morally responsible. For instance, suppose you had a choice between two spouses. One freely loves you, the other has a robot love for you, and they're just sort of compelled to do so. Who would you rather be your spouse? I claim that the answer is the one that freely loves you rather than the robot. So it seems as though the greater being is the one that's responsible. So that's the so what, to respond to it, right? It's a radical revision and not in the right direction. So with that, we conclude our argument, and the conclusion that we established, or that at least we attempted to, is that God is not morally responsible. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone, and I really appreciate the discussion, and I'm excited for your questions.
Thank you for that. I thought that was an excellent presentation. So I'm interested in the last bit. I'm not clear on why it matters, both for the debate and in general. So the topic of the debate is whether God exists. Seems like you gave an argument to the effect that if God exists, he doesn't have a property that various theists have ascribed to God historically. But how is that not analogous to the following kind of thing? So imagine we have a seminar about the existence of the historical Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, and then the people going to the seminar believe both that he exists and they think of him under a description that includes various attitudes of agential praise, like, thank you, Lord Buddha, for founding Buddhism. And then the premise of the conference is, does the historical Buddha exist? So the skeptics go up on the stage and they give arguments to the effect that there was no historical Buddha, the texts are too late, blah, blah, blah. And then you go up on the stage and you say, it wouldn't be fitting to have reverential attitudes of praise and thanks towards the historical Buddha because, for example, there's no moral responsibility, or he didn't have a self, so there's no one to be grateful to. It seems like the two arguments are in a similar boat. Like, I took it that we were discussing whether God existed, not whether it's fitting to feel a certain type of way about him.
Okay, good. So first of all, I really appreciate the question. So yeah, you might say something like, well, look, who gives a toss about whether or not he has this notion of responsibility and whether or not we conceive of him as having that notion of responsibility? Would that be a fair characterization of
I might make it a bit more targeted. People might give a toss because it will bear on whether it's fitting for them to worship God in the way that they traditionally have, have the same attitudes they previously had. But what I'm asking about is about its dialectical relevance here, because there are all kinds of things that we should care about and have reason to care about. Important debates that just aren't relevant here.
Okay, good. So here's the reason why it might be relevant. There are a lot of theists, one of whom Matthew is very sympathetic to Richard Swinburne, who think that praise and worship are necessary conditions for theism. Okay, if you think that they're necessary conditions for theism, and you think that praise and worship only makes sense if we have accountability, responsibility, then this is going to be really important. Okay, and here's the reason why it's going to be really important, because worship is going to look really, really weird if God doesn't have accountability, responsibility. It's going to be like worshiping a sunset, or it's going to be like worshiping a nuclear bomb. Okay, strange, bizarre, odd, off. Now that's the reason why it's relevant, is because I'm going to be like, what exactly are you doing, right? When you worship God, what exactly are you doing when you thank him for something that he was compelled to do? So here's an example, right? Let's say that we have someone that was compelled to donate to charity, right? So there was something within them. They had a brain tumor. They had to donate to Oxfam. And then you say something like, oh, well, I'm going to praise them for their actions. You're like, that's a little bit strange, right? So people have noted this within the literature. Like, it's a little bit of a bizarre thing to do. But it's a very radical result to think that everybody who worships God or everybody that praises him is engaged in a similarly bizarre practice. That's the problem.
Well,
That's the relevance.
Here's what
if you think it's an essential condition.
Right. Okay. So I take two things, right? So I grant that if you're right, then this has revisionary consequences, and you might even think it's strange and weird and bizarre. But what I'm not granting is that this bears directly on the question of whether God exists, just like questions about whether we ought to give thanks to the Buddha bears on the question of whether historical Buddha exists. And so you gave an argument to the effect that if we fix into the definition of God that it's fitting to give to him the types of worship and praise that would be undermined by your argument if it were sound, then that model of God would be refuted. But it's not clear to me why I can't just define God under a different description.
Yeah. Good.
And then say that, and in fact, the ways in which Matthew and I define God didn't include that description. And so it's not clear that it makes contact with what we're saying.
So I really appreciate the point. And as I understand it, you're like, how does this make contact with our arguments? Okay. And what exactly is it doing? So let me bring in a little bit of Marie Kondo style organization, just so maybe this will clarify things. Yeah, you like that. Okay, so here's the idea. So you might conceive of the argument that we're running as a type B argument against theism, as Nagasawa would characterize it. So what we're saying is that God has responsibility, but then he has also moral perfection, right? These two things cannot happen at the same time. And so just as you might think that you have these arguments where you have two properties and then they're inconsistent with one another, and so whatever being is described by those properties doesn't exist, that's the problem. Okay. Now, I totally grant, and I think that Steve would as well, that you could go the maximal God approach and say, well, this is just an argument against God having one of those properties. But then notice that's going to then collapse back into the so what objection. So really, in answer to your point, when you say, like, what's the dialectical significance of it? It's, we think that responsibility is going to have to be a divine attribute. If you think that it's going to be a divine attribute, then I can run a type B style argument, which would go against theism. If you then retreat and then you say, I'm going to go maximal God approach, he doesn't have one of those properties, I'm going to kind of like siphon that out, then we have other responses. But I'm going to go to Steve.
Well,
because
I don't, this doesn't strike me as at all plausible. I mean, so imagine a person, they believe in an omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent being who they think is the very best possible being and created the universe and, did all these things, but they don't think they're worthy of worship. And the reason they don't think that they're worthy of worship is because they basically think that they're not morally responsible, and they don't actually think there can be a being that's worthy of worship in this way. I wouldn't call such a person an atheist.
Steve, do you want to take this one? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you asked how it intersected with the argument. So both you guys gave arguments, and quite good arguments, on why you thought that we needed theism to explain things. And then you had notions of God. But if those notions of God are implausible because the better version is the greatest possible being, then you're duty bound to defend the greatest possible being. But if the greatest possible being is unstable or seems to have internal contradictions, that's a problem. Now, for example, you think that God is Amos brought up. I think Richard Swinburne agreed that God's an omnipotent being. Obviously, the power is irrelevant. I mean, how much you bench press is irrelevant to your work. That's not a very plausible theory. If the 3O being is implausible, if the O's contradict each other, and I think they do, right? It's not a case that someone who's essentially omnibenevolent can do evil acts. It's not the case that someone who's essentially omnibenevolent can have evil thoughts. So those are not going to be a plausible account. So you think, okay, well, what is the coherent notion of God that you brought forth? And infinite mind's not going to do it either, because we still want to know, is the mind good or bad? How does it exercise as well? So let me switch. It's got to be something like the greatest possible being. But there we might have an instability in that we might think, look, is the greatest possible being a being which is essentially all good and not responsible, or one which is contingently all good and is responsible? Well, there, it's a fair question to say, is this so coherent? Do we have a coherent notion here? And if we think that the answer is intuitively the better being is the being that's contingently all good and responsible, then you give up independence. You say, okay, well then independence isn't valuable. If you go the other way, you give up responsibility. But it seems it's a real question whether there's a coherent notion left by this time we start giving up those things.
So, so I guess I have a story about how you get the rest of the properties from being a limitless mind, where he knows all the moral facts and then having no contrary psychological inclination is motivated to follow them. That maybe we could talk about that. Probably that would take us a bit too far afield. But I guess, so even if you think God is the greatest conceivable being, maybe
the greatest possible being, not the greatest conceivable.
Greatest possible being. So maybe it's a little bit unfortunate that God isn't responsible. Maybe all else equal, it would be a bit better if God was responsible. But maybe if a being that's that great just can't be responsible, then maybe the greatest possible being maybe is missing a few other good properties that some other beings have. It doesn't have to be, it just has to be that he has the best combination of properties, not that he has every good property. So if this argument is right and the greatest possible being just can't have the property of being independent, of being responsible, that seems fine. Just say, okay, maybe he's not responsible.
So I'm just curious. So what do you think is the defining feature? So I mean, essential omnibenevolence, I'm going to claim, knocks out essential omnipotence and knocks out essentially omniscience. If you're essentially all good, then you simply can't perform evil acts. If you're essentially all good, you can't know the joys of evil in a way in which you have a pro attitude toward them. So is it your view that the greatest possible being just is and only is sort of the maximally intrinsically good being? Is that your claim?
So my view is that God's essential property is being a limitless mind. And then the idea is because the mind knows everything, he knows all the moral reasons to perform acts. And if you're aware of some moral reason and you don't have a contrary psychological inclination, then you'll be motivated to follow it. Just like if you know that some action will cause you a future period of suffering, if you're rational and don't have any rational failings, then you'll be motivated to follow it. So from that, you get God being. That's actually that's where I'm inclined to go. I don't thinking that God's perfect. That also strikes me as another plausible way to go. I basically think there are kind of a number of somewhat plausible options. I guess I want to say something about
just a quick follow. Why would the great maker be the processing capacity of God's mind rather than omnibenevolence? That is, you might think the infinity of God's mind explains or causes his moral perfection, but it's not the perfect maker. So I'm curious as to why you think being an infinite mind is itself that which makes him the greatest possible being.
So I wasn't saying that it was the thing that made him the greatest possible being. I was saying just that I think that's what his essential property is. That's at least my best guess. And then from that, you get the rest of the properties flowing. And then if it turns out, so maybe this is the greatest possible being, maybe it's not if, as you say, there's no greatest possible being, and then it's just a, sort of like tied or something. But, if the argument's established that there's an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being, that tells us something. Regarding your point about the paradox of omniscience and omnibenevolence, omnipotence and omnibenevolence. So I think we should construe omnipotence as being about there being nothing you can't do that's possible for lack of power. So maybe there are things that you're never disposed to do. But if you could do them if you wanted to, but just don't want to do them, it's not a restraint on your power. So, if you had a person who they never wanted to torture a baby, but they could if they wanted to, it seems weird to say that that's a restriction on their power. And even if there's some way of defining power where it's a restriction on it, define power star as being such that there's no action for which you can't do it except for lack of trying. And then it doesn't seem bad to say that God has power star rather than power, if that's the right semantic account of what power means.
So just a question about that point. So if we're talking about power, or someone's ability to do something, right? I think that is one way of assuming it is like I have the power to do it if it's possible for me to do it, right? But doesn't
I disagree with that account.
Okay. So maybe that's where you and I are going to diverge then, which is fine. So that's kind of at least in part what's motivating it, is that I think what Steve and I think, and maybe Steve can come in here, is that we're going to think something like, if it's true to say that you have the power to do it, it's going to be possible for you to do it. So if you give me an account where I say, well, we look at all the possible worlds, we kind of go from the third person perspective, we look down and there's no possible world in which you do it. It's kind of like necessarily the case that you don't do it. It's difficult to see in what sense you have the power to do it.
So you have the power to do it in the sense that you would be able to do it if you wanted to do it. Even if there's no possible world where you want to do it, if there's no restriction on your ability to do it, then it seems like it's a restriction on your power. So suppose there's no possible world where I would be disposed to kick Amos in the head. Actually, there are plenty of possible, but very few, to be clear. If I have the ability to do it, but just there's no possible world where I want to do it, then it seems weird to think this is a restraint on my power. It's just a restraint on what I want to do, not what I'm able to do. And power is about restraint on what you're able to do.
Okay. Do you think that Patty Hearst has the power not to rob the bank? If she's fully compelled, then, on your view?
So my view about the Patty Hearst case is that so I think if it's a free choice from Patty Hearst and she has libertarian free will, then I think she would be responsible, even if the psychology. So if she's not aware of it would depend to some degree on whether she's aware of the morally relevant facts. So if she's aware of the morally relevant reasons not to do it, then she would be responsible and blameworthy.
But let's stick to the case, right? So on your view, if she wanted, right, to do it, if she wanted to, for instance, like go get a Krispy Kreme, then, whatever. But what we're interested in is that I look at all the possible worlds, and there isn't a single possible world in which Patty Hearst gets a Krispy Kreme. And then I say, well, because she's compelled to rob the bank, she's just never going to pick the Krispy Kreme over the bank. And on your view, you're going to say something like, well, maybe she still has the power to do it, even though her psychology compels her otherwise.
Right. So the things that you are potentially responsible for are the things where if you had wanted to do them, you'd be responsible. So if Patty Hearst, just in all possible worlds, has sort of, selfish desires and doesn't want to do the thing, then she would, she could still be responsible. And that I think, as I said, I think responsibility is about what you could do if you wanted to, not about what you want to do. Now, of course, exactly how blameworthy you are will depend on the strength of your desires, and there's.
So I'm a little bit lost on the Patty Hearst case. Leave aside the power. I want to talk about responsibility. So Patty Hearst is 100% manipulated, so that her psychology supports robbing the Hibernia Bank. Now, your view is, and I mean, she has some sense of knowledge of the good and the right. I mean, she's not ignorant. I mean, they while they were redoing her psychology, they didn't disrupt her knowledge of it, but she just understands it in these radical Marxist terms. So is your claim that she's responsible because she could step outside of her psychology and act against that, or is it your view that she could not do this and yet stay within her psychology? Because the idea is that her psychology, the combination of the network, the values, beliefs, intentions as a whole, support robbing the bank and do so quite strongly. So I'm not sure how you think she could be responsible unless she can step outside of her psychology.
So I think she's responsible if she chose it. Now, if she's responsible in a way that merits blame, maybe I think that would likely require that she was aware that it was wrong. So if you do what you think is right, but you're mistaken, I think in general you're not responsible. Maybe there's some cases where you are.
Well, but it seems as though the psychology compelled the choice. So in what sense would she be responsible for the choice which flowed from the psychology over which she had no control?
So I guess if the psychology, I'm a libertarian, so I think you have sort of a free, unconstrained choice. And so if you're a libertarian, then I think you would want to say that the psychology didn't compel the choice, that ultimately there was the psychology, and then it was kind of up to her what she ultimately decided to do.
Steve, do you want to come in?
Inside that libertarian picture, what I'm a little lost at is how could she be responsible and not blameworthy? I mean, you might think blameworthy just is negative responsibility, and that phrase really is positive responsibility. So if she was in the sense that she earned credit or discredit for what she did, and she robbed the bank, presumably she earned discredit, so she'd be blameworthy. If she couldn't earn discredit, then she couldn't also be responsible. So the middle ground that you're trying to put, I'm not sure I understand that. I'm not
sorry.
Sure.
I wasn't taking what I said to require a distinction between being blameworthy and being responsible. Maybe I said something that.
But going back to God, I mean, what I don't understand is if you think, now you said metaphysically you think God is an infinite mind, but again, I mean, there's a problem is if you don't have an argument outside of the modal ontological argument, it's not clear why that should be the central feature. Now you might claim, well, I do have an argument. I've given you my, why do I exist argument. I guess we just have to get to the nuts and bolts of that argument. But if you were to think that the theist lives or dies on the modal ontological argument, it's a little bit hard to see how they couldn't focus on whatever the
I cannot think of a single proposition I reject more than that the theist lives or dies on the modal ontological argument. I utterly reject the modal ontological argument and have rejected it since the very first time I heard it. I definitely don't think that theism lives on it. I don't even think it's sound as a theist because I think God is contingent. But I agree, if you thought that, and you thought that there was incoherence in thinking that God was the greatest conceivable being, then you would have in trouble.
Okay, let's just give Nathan, Stephen, you guys get the last word here because we're really out of time, and then we can just wrap this up.
Oh, okay. Nathan, you want me to do it?
Yeah, sure. So I'll do my stuff, and then maybe we could have an after show about some theistic evidence.
Keep it short,
but yeah, so I think that really all we want to say is something of the following, right? So what we're interested in is whether the greatest possible being exists. That's the kind of clash point. That's the question I'm just going to, does he exist? And our answer to that question is no. What's the reason? Because it's an incoherent concept. What shows that it's an incoherent concept? Because such a being couldn't be responsible, but the greatest possible being would have to be responsible, or at least we have very good reasons for thinking that such a being would be responsible. And why not think that he's responsible? Because of the compulsion argument. God is compelled. If God is compelled, then he's not responsible. He's compelled because he has his psychology essentially. If you have your psychology essentially, then you don't control the psychology. You don't control the action that flows from the psychology, so you're not in control of the resulting choice. This is really important. If you jettison responsibility, then worship is going to fall out, and worship is a very central component of theism as such. Now, you can make any view consistent, you can make any view sexy, you can make any view palatable if you bite enough bullets, but you're going to be chewing a lot of lead, but maybe that's what Amos likes. So I don't know. But that's my closing statement. So I'll go over to Amos and Matthew for whatever they'd like to say. But I've really appreciated the discussion. And more importantly, I've appreciated how friendly and nice it's been.
So I do I don't know. Matthew, you go first.
Yeah. So and thanks so much, Nathan and Steve. Both of these guys are great. Big fan of them both. So I guess so the main, we've talked about our arguments. Nathan had the kind of divine psychology worry for the anthropic argument, which I don't think held up. I don't think it's plausible that we're just totally in the dark about the probabilities of God doing everything, so that there's nothing that we can say that's likelier given theism than atheism. I think the awesome theistic evidence where the stars spell out made by God, if that's evidence for theism, then I think we should say, okay, then we're not totally in the dark about the odds of God doing different things. And then Steve's worry was it committed the inverse Gambor's fallacy. I think when you get precise about the probabilities, it's clear that it doesn't do that. When you just take into account your uncertainty about which person you are, it clearly doesn't do that. Okay, so that's the kind of concerns about the anthropic argument. I guess maybe so with the responsibility argument. Maybe I'll talk about that one, and Amos, I'll let you talk about the other argument. So the things to say about the responsibility argument, I mean, if God can't be responsible, that would be very interesting, but I don't think it would tell us whether God, doesn't exist. I don't think there's a reason to think that the greatest possible being would have to be responsible. So if you prove that the greatest possible being just couldn't be responsible, okay, maybe the greatest possible being isn't responsible. Certainly, it's not a part of any of my conception of God that it has to be responsible as an analytic truth. Now, and then I think God could be responsible for the reason I described, which is that ultimately it's up to God what to do. God freely chooses what to do. And then God is just, in all possible worlds, disposed to pick one thing. So just like if there are options that are open to you, but you are always disposed to choose one of them, I think you would still get credit for it. A kind of meta point is, I think when we dig into many different kinds of things, like, string theory and physics, when you peek under the hood at ultimate reality, it often turns out to be really weird and seemingly paradoxical and confusing. This is also true in like quantum mechanics and so on. I think we should expect God to be the same way. So I'm not that troubled by there being like a few divine properties that seem on their face a little bit in tension. It would be one thing if there was some outright contradiction or some clear arguments, but insofar as it's just these kind of, hard to parse and debatable alleged warring divine properties, this doesn't strike me as having that much force. And I think it's actually what we would expect of a true theory. If there was nothing that was weird or puzzling about it, you should expect that human beings made it up. So that's basically what I have to say. Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay.
You want to go and I'll go after you?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for that debate. That was super. It didn't really feel like a debate. It felt like a long conversation. I loved it. I'll just, I guess, comment on all of the speeches apart from Matthew's, because obviously that speaks for itself and it was very convincing. Yeah, so as far as the argument from psychophysical harmony goes, I took it that the main objection that went unresolved, at least as far as Nathan and Steve were concerned, it seemed like they weren't fully convinced of it by the end, was the objection that type B or a posteriori physicalism still poses a problem for the argument, such that if you're inclined to accept that view of mind at the beginning, it's going to pose a real problem for getting to the conclusion that God probably exists. I think I explained a number of times why I don't think that's right. I guess it's up to the audience whether, or really it's down to me whether that came across clearly enough. But I would just exhort Nathan and Steve and everyone listening who wasn't convinced by what I said to just go to the original psychophysical harmony paper, read the section by Cutter and Crummett on the Hesperus and phosphorus stuff, and then read it 3 more times. And I'm really, really confident that if you do that, you will come to understand what we're saying and that you will be convinced by it, because it's that clear, I think. So just, I guess, quickly on the responsibility stuff, and then I'll go to Steve's argument. I guess my main objection was just that I took it to be orthogonal to the debate we were having. So it felt like as though somebody was giving an argument for Unitarianism over Trinitarianism, and then they were concluding that God doesn't exist because lots of theists have thought that God is triune as opposed to Unitarian. And I just don't think this is the right way to go. Now, it's true, obviously, that if you define God as Trinitarian and then you give an argument against Trinitarian theism, then you'll conclude with atheism. But I think there's just no pressure to define it that way. Insofar as the problem is about warring divine attributes, I actually think given that the argument employed a bunch of premises about moral responsibility that are super contentious in the moral responsibility literature, what I'd recommend is, if this is the objection, just switch to a much more simple objection. Like, for example, being courageous is an important good, but God can't have that because he knows everything, and there's nothing scary for him to anticipate. So all the perfect being theists grant that God can't be courageous for that reason, or can't be courageous in the relevant respect. But it doesn't rely on any super controversial premises about free will and responsibility. So insofar as that's the argument you want to push, I just recommend going to one of the much more simple divine attribute clashes and running with that. As far as Steve's argument goes, yeah, I guess Matthew and I just don't accept either that God is necessary or that we live or die on the modal ontological argument. And as a theist, insofar as I would rather die as a theist than concede that I ride or die on the modal ontological argument. I think that's an absurd proposition. I'm also not so sure we heard a spelled out reason why that was the case, but that was probably due to time constraints. I turn things over to Steve. Thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Okay, you guys have been great. I really enjoyed the arguments. I'll make it quick. As I mentioned, I think that Matthew's argument falls prey to the inverse gambler's fallacy. He argued from the probability of one person's that I exist depends on the probability of the number of other people existing. That's classic inverse gambler's fallacy. His response was, well, you don't know which identity you are. I'm not even sure what that means. I mean, presumably you know who you are. I don't know what it means to say you don't know who your identity is. Amos's argument, when I asked Amos about the divine command theory of the nature of a person, he seemed to deny it. He seemed to say, look, it's just a metaphysical fact that the subject of conscience is, X. Let's say X is a brain. And then when you add physics to that, you think, okay, well, then why does that even allow for the possibility of sort of psychophysical disharmony? These guys are both great philosophers, and it's a pleasure to talk to them. But I didn't really follow his response. I mean, you might think, look, whatever metaphysically produces the subject of consciousness, why wouldn't it also produce the way in which the system aligns? Now you might think, okay, well, maybe God could have created different systems with completely different neural systems, things with other than neural systems. Maybe, but that's a very different argument from the one that Amos gave. And then my argument was that, look, if you rely on the notion that God is the greatest possible being, that carries with it independence. If you want to deny that God is independent, if you want to say that God, what he does is arbitrary or a brute fact, that is, it lacks a justification, he's not omni-rational, I'm just not sure what's left of the notion of the greatest possible being. I mean, if you either seem to say, well, look, independence is not part of the greatest possible being, right? We just have to allow in brute facts, and I don't know why that wouldn't apply to the universe as a whole. Or you have to say that independence is part of the greatest possible being, in which case I'm just not sure how you handle world creation. But in any case, I've really enjoyed the conversation. You guys are all great, and it's been a real pleasure.
Okay, that was a great conversation. Everybody, please subscribe to my channel because, a lot of people watch the videos. They don't even subscribe. It's just really annoying. I'm not even, they don't okay, let's just end it.
And are those people responsible?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. You tell me.